What happens when you pour 4 gallons of gasoline into a crack in the earth and drop a match? For Brandon Silverhorn, it meant becoming trapped in a tomb of rock with temperatures dropping below freezing and rescue seemingly impossible. Brandon Silverhorn had exactly 3 seconds between dropping a burning rag into the desert floor and watching the earth explode beneath his feet. 3 seconds before he plummeted into what would become his underground prison. The Arizona desert holds many secrets, carved deep into its ancient bones by millennia of wind, water, and time. But on the night of December 21, 1997, it would nearly claim a human life in the most terrifying way imaginable. The temperature had been dropping steadily as evening approached, the desert's notorious ability to shed heat with the setting sun already making itself known. At 9 p.m., the thermometer read 38 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. Winter in Arizona carries its own deadly bite, a bone-deep cold that seeps through clothing and into marrow, unforgiving and relentless. 5 young men gathered in the fading light, their breath visible in small puffs as they spoke in hushed, excited tones. Brandon Silverhorn, 22 years old with sandy hair and an infectious grin that had gotten him into more trouble than he cared to admit, stood at the center of the group. His friends, Christopher Reed, Gus Hansen, John Salazar, and Jeremy Platt, had all heard his wild idea and, despite every rational instinct screaming against it, had agreed to come along for what Brandon promised would be the most incredible thing you've ever seen. They had driven 47 miles southeast of Tucson to reach the Safford Shafts, a desolate expanse of desert that locals called Red Nest, a name that should have served as a warning. This wasn't a place where people came to have fun. It was a geological anomaly where the dried bed of an ancient lake had been carved into a maze of deep pits and treacherous chasms. The landscape stretched before them like something from another planet. Jagged rock formations jutted skyward at impossible angles, their surfaces polished smooth by countless years of sandblasting winds. Between these monuments to erosion lay the pits, some 40 feet deep, others plunging 60 feet or more into Stygian darkness. The largest of these chasms was capped by a 4-foot-thick layer of sedimentary rock, beneath which lay 60 feet of compressed silt from the ancient lake bed. As they unloaded their supplies from the pickup truck, 4 red plastic gas containers, each holding a gallon of regular unleaded gasoline, along with some old rags and a lighter, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the smell of sage and creosote, mixed now with the sharp petroleum scent of their accelerant. "You sure about this, Brandon?" Christopher Reed asked, his voice betraying more nervousness than he wanted to admit. At 19, he was the youngest of the group, and something about this place, the way the wind moaned through the rock formations, the absolute darkness that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams, made his skin crawl. Brandon laughed, the sound echoing strangely off the surrounding stone. "Come on, Chris. When have any of my ideas ever gone wrong?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, because they all knew the answer to that. What had started as idle conversation over beers 3 nights earlier had evolved into this moment of reckless determination. Brandon had heard about the fissures from a geology student at the community college, narrow cracks in the rock that dropped straight down into underground chambers carved out by water flow thousands of years ago. The student had mentioned how echolocation had revealed vast caverns beneath the surface, some filled with pockets of methane gas from decaying organic matter. That detail, the methane gas, had sparked Brandon's imagination. What if, he'd wondered aloud to his friends, what if you could create a controlled explosion down there? Not enough to cause real damage, just enough to create a spectacular show. Like the world's most impressive firework, shot in reverse. Now, standing at the edge of the fissure they'd selected, Brandon felt his pulse quicken with anticipation. The crack in the bedrock was barely 14 inches wide at its broadest point, narrowing to perhaps 8 inches in some places. When they shined their flashlights down into it, the beams seemed to disappear entirely, swallowed by a darkness so complete it felt almost tangible. "Jesus," Gus Hansen muttered, kneeling beside the fissure and peering down. "How deep do you think this goes?" "Only one way to find out," Brandon replied, hefting the first container of gasoline. The plan was simple in its stupidity: pour the gasoline down the fissure, wait a few minutes for the vapors to settle and hopefully mix with any methane gas trapped below, then drop a burning rag and step back to watch the show. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. As Brandon began pouring the first gallon of gasoline into the narrow opening, the desert around them seemed to grow quieter. Even the constant wind that had been whistling through the rock seemed to diminish, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The gasoline disappeared into the darkness with barely a sound, no splash, no echo to indicate it had hit bottom. This should have been their first clue that they were dealing with something far more complex and dangerous than they'd imagined. The fissure wasn't just a simple crack in the rock, it was the opening to an underground labyrinth that had been carved by water and time into a network of chambers and passages that could extend for miles beneath the desert floor. By the time he'd emptied the third container, an acrid chemical smell had begun to rise from the fissure, carried upward by air currents they couldn't see or understand. From deep within the fissure came a sound, a low, almost subsonic rumbling, like distant thunder or a freight train passing far underground. "That's just the gas settling," Brandon said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "It's probably echoing off the chamber walls down there." But Christopher Reed was already backing away from the edge. "Maybe we should rethink this, man. That doesn't sound right." Brandon poured the fourth and final gallon of gasoline into the fissure, then stepped back and wiped his hands on his jeans. The smell was stronger now, a choking petroleum reek that made their eyes water. From below came another rumble, longer and louder than the first. Gus Hansen produced a red Bic lighter, his hand shaking slightly as he handed it over. Brandon soaked the rag in gasoline from a small amount he'd saved in an empty beer bottle, then held the cloth away from his body as he flicked the lighter. The flame caught immediately, burning bright orange in the desert darkness. "Everyone ready?" he asked, looking around at his friends. In the flickering light of the burning rag, their faces looked pale and uncertain. This was the moment when any one of them could have spoken up, could have said the words that would have prevented the disaster that followed. Brandon stepped to the edge of the fissure, the burning rag held high above his head like some primitive torch. The flame danced in the wind, casting wild shadows across the surrounding rocks. For a moment, he hesitated. Something about the sound coming from below, that deep, rhythmic rumbling, gave him pause. But the moment passed, and he dropped the burning rag into the darkness. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing happened. The rag fell, its flame growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. The 5 young men stood in silence, staring down into the blackness, waiting. Then the earth exploded. The sound was indescribable, not just heard but felt, a percussion wave that seemed to originate from the center of the earth itself. It was the sound of fundamental forces being unleashed, of tons of rock being pulverized and hurled skyward, of the very bedrock being torn apart by energies no human should have tampered with. The ground beneath their feet bucked and heaved like a living thing. Brandon, who had been standing closest to the fissure, felt the stone crack and shift under his boots. What had been solid rock just moments before suddenly became as unstable as quicksand. A column of fire erupted from the fissure, shooting 30 feet into the air with a roar like a jet engine. But this wasn't the controlled burn they had expected, it was a volcanic eruption of flame and superheated gas that turned the night sky orange and sent waves of scorching heat washing over them. The narrow fissure, which had been barely wide enough to accept the gasoline containers, suddenly yawned open like a wound in the earth. Rock that had been compressed and stable for millennia split apart with sounds like gunshots. Debris, chunks of stone ranging from pebbles to boulders the size of car engines, flew through the air with deadly velocity. Christopher Reed was struck in the chest by a piece of flying rock and sent sprawling. Gus Hansen caught a fragment across his forehead, opening a gash that immediately began streaming blood down his face. John Salazar threw himself flat as a boulder the size of a washing machine whistled over his head and crashed into the desert behind them. But Brandon Silverhorn, who had been standing at the very edge of the fissure when the explosion occurred, faced a different fate entirely. The force of the blast hit Brandon like a physical blow, but it wasn't the initial shockwave that doomed him, it was what came after. The explosion had destabilized the entire rock formation around the fissure, turning solid stone into a crumbling, treacherous landscape that shifted and collapsed with each passing second. As the column of fire roared skyward and debris rained down around them, Brandon felt the ground give way beneath his feet. Not gradually, not with any warning. One moment he was standing on solid rock, and the next he was falling through space, the rim of the fissure rushing past him as gravity claimed its prize. He had perhaps 2 seconds to comprehend what was happening, 2 seconds to understand that he was plummeting into the very pit they had just turned into a hell mouth, 2 seconds to feel the terror of absolute helplessness as the walls of the fissure closed in around him. The fall lasted forever and was over in an instant. 40 feet down through the widened crack, tumbling and bouncing off the rough stone walls, his body a rag doll in the grip of physics and fate. He hit the first ledge with his left leg, and the sound of his femur snapping was audible even over the continuing rumble of falling debris. The impact spun him around, sending him sliding further down into the tilted crevice that had been carved by underground water flow. He came to rest 23 feet below the surface, wedged in a space barely wide enough to contain his body. His left leg was twisted at an impossible angle, the bone driven through muscle and skin in a compound fracture that sent waves of agony through his entire nervous system. His ribs had been cracked against the stone walls during his fall, making each breath a symphony of pain. But the worst was yet to come. Even as Brandon lay broken and bleeding in the depths of the earth, the explosion above continued to wreak havoc on the geological structure of the area. With a sound like the world ending, a massive slab of bedrock, 3 feet thick, 5 feet wide, and weighing approximately 2 tons, broke loose from the wall of the expanded fissure and came sliding down toward him. Brandon, semi-conscious from pain and shock, became aware of a new sound, a grinding, scraping noise that seemed to be coming from directly above him. He forced his eyes open and looked up, just in time to see the enormous piece of stone sliding down the walls of the crevice like some massive tombstone seeking its grave. He tried to move, tried to drag himself further into the narrow space where he was trapped, but his broken leg wouldn't respond and his position was too awkward to allow for any meaningful escape. The slab of rock settled over the opening above him with a grinding finality, sealing him into what had suddenly become his tomb. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound could have been. Brandon Silverhorn lay in darkness so complete it seemed to have physical weight. The massive stone slab above him had cut off not just the light from the surface, but most of the air circulation as well. The space where he was trapped was roughly the size of a coffin, 7 feet long, perhaps 18 inches wide at its broadest point, and barely 2 feet high. His left leg, broken in at least 2 places, had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The pain was beyond description, a constant, throbbing agony that seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. But worse than the pain was the pressure. The way he was wedged into the crevice put tremendous strain on his kidneys and abdomen, making each breath a monumental effort. The cold was immediate and merciless. December in the Arizona desert can see temperatures drop into the 20s, and here below ground, insulated from any residual warmth from the day's sun, the chill seeped through his clothes and into his bones with relentless efficiency. He could feel his core temperature beginning to drop, his body's natural heating system overwhelmed by the combination of injury, shock, and exposure. Above him, he could hear voices, his friends calling his name, their shouts distorted and muffled by the tons of rock that now separated them. He tried to respond, tried to call out, but the explosion had filled the air with dust and debris, and his throat was clogged with grit and blood. When he tried to shout, only a weak croak emerged. Time became meaningless in the darkness. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. Brandon drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind alternating between periods of sharp, agonizing awareness and merciful blackness. During his lucid moments, he became acutely aware of every detail of his situation, the sharp edges of rock pressing against his ribs, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, the way his broken leg throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Above ground, chaos reigned. The explosion had created a crater roughly 20 feet in diameter where the narrow fissure had once been. Christopher Reed, blood streaming from a gash on his scalp, staggered to his feet and immediately began shouting Brandon's name. The other three, all nursing injuries of their own, joined him at the edge of the new crater, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the swirling dust and debris. "Brandon! Brandon, can you hear me?" Christopher's voice echoed off the walls of the pit, but there was no response. Jeremy Platt, his left arm hanging useless at his side from a dislocated shoulder, managed to get his flashlight working and aimed it down into the depths. What he saw made his blood run cold. The neat, narrow fissure they had been pouring gasoline into was gone, replaced by a jagged crater that seemed to have no bottom. Worse, he could see that massive slabs of rock had broken loose and fallen into the pit. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "If he's down there." "He's alive," Gus Hansen said firmly, though his voice shook with emotion. "He has to be alive." They spent the next 20 minutes trying everything they could think of to establish contact with Brandon. They shouted until their voices were hoarse. They threw rocks down into the pit, listening for any response. They even tried lowering a flashlight on a rope, though the beam revealed nothing but more fallen rock and debris. It was John Salazar who finally spoke the words they were all thinking: "We need help. Real help. We can't do this ourselves." The drive back to town was a nightmare of guilt, fear, and desperate urgency. Christopher pushed the pickup truck to its limits on the winding desert roads, while the others used his cell phone to try to contact emergency services. The signal was weak and intermittent, but they managed to get through to the Cochise County Sheriff's Department. "We need search and rescue," Jeremy said into the phone, his voice cracking with emotion. "Our friend, there was an explosion. He's trapped underground." The Cochise County Search and Rescue Team arrived at the Safford Shafts at 11:47 p.m. Captain Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran of desert rescue operations, took one look at the scene and felt her heart sink. The crater where Brandon had fallen was a nightmare of unstable rock and shifting debris. Worse, the explosion had created new fractures in the surrounding bedrock, making the entire area treacherous. The first challenge was simply determining where exactly Brandon was located within the complex network of chambers and passages that honeycombed the ground beneath their feet. The explosion had created multiple new openings and collapsed several others. For all they knew, he could be anywhere within a 100-yard radius of the main crater. Dr. Sarah Chen, a structural geologist from the University of Arizona, arrived just after midnight with ground-penetrating radar equipment. Working by the harsh glare of portable floodlights, her team began mapping the underground structure, looking for any sign of voids or spaces large enough to contain a human being. What they discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The radar revealed that Brandon was indeed trapped in a narrow crevice approximately 40 feet below the surface, sealed beneath what appeared to be a massive slab of solid rock. He was alive. The equipment detected what might have been movement or breathing, but his location made rescue nearly impossible. The slab of rock sealing Brandon into his underground prison weighed an estimated 4,000 pounds and was wedged so tightly into the crevice that conventional extraction methods wouldn't work. They couldn't simply use winches and cables to lift it out. The surrounding rock was too unstable, and any significant vibration might cause a complete collapse that would kill Brandon instantly. As the hours passed, the situation became increasingly desperate. The outside temperature had dropped to 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and the readings from their remote sensors suggested that the temperature in Brandon's underground tomb was even lower. Hypothermia was setting in, and with his injuries and the stress of his situation, his body was rapidly reaching the limits of its ability to cope. At 3:15 a.m., nearly 6 hours after the explosion, the rescue operation began in earnest. Working in two-man teams and rotating every 30 minutes to avoid fatigue, the rescuers began the slow process of creating the infrastructure they would need to move the slab. Each blow of the chisel had to be carefully placed and precisely controlled. Too much force and they risked cracking the slab or causing it to shift position. Too little and they would never create the necessary attachment points. The work was made even more difficult by the confined space and the angle of the crevice. The rescuers had to work lying on their stomachs, reaching down into the crater with tools barely long enough to reach the stone. Every few minutes, debris from their chiseling would rain down into the space where Brandon lay trapped, and they would have to stop and listen, hoping to hear some sign that he was still alive. At 4:30 a.m., they heard it, a weak tapping sound from below, metal on stone. Brandon was conscious and trying to communicate. The sound energized the entire rescue team. Working with renewed urgency, they completed the process of creating anchor points on the massive slab and began rigging the complex pulley system that would be needed to lift it. 6 men would be required to provide the lifting force, coordinated precisely to ensure that the slab moved straight up rather than shifting sideways and potentially crushing Brandon. At 5:47 a.m., as the first pale light of dawn began to appear over the eastern mountains, Captain Santos gave the order to begin the lift. 6 rescuers took their positions at the ropes, while others stood by with monitoring equipment to track the movement of the slab and watch for any signs of structural instability. "Slow and steady," Santos called out. "No sudden movements. If anyone feels the load shifting, call it out immediately." The ropes went taut, and for a moment nothing happened. The slab seemed locked in place, as much a part of the bedrock as if it had been there for thousands of years. Then, with a grinding sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, it began to move. Inch by inch, the massive piece of stone rose from its position. Debris rained down from the edges where it had been wedged, and several times the operation had to be stopped while rocks and dirt settled. But gradually, inevitably, the slab rose high enough to create an opening into the space where Brandon lay trapped. Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, the team's medical officer, was the first person to see him. Rappelling down into the crevice with a headlamp and emergency medical supplies, she called up to the surface, "I've got him. He's alive." What Dr. Rodriguez found in that narrow underground tomb would haunt her for years afterward. Brandon had been wedged into a space so constricted that he couldn't move more than a few inches in any direction. His left leg was grotesquely swollen and twisted, obviously fractured in multiple places. His lips were blue with hypothermia, his breathing shallow and rapid. His core body temperature had dropped to just over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, another few degrees and his organs would have begun shutting down. But he was conscious, aware, and somehow still fighting to survive. "Brandon," Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice carefully controlled to hide her horror at his condition. "My name is Lisa. I'm a doctor, and we're going to get you out of here." Brandon tried to speak, but only a weak croak emerged from his throat. His eyes, however, were alert and focused on her face with an intensity that spoke of incredible willpower and determination. The extraction process was even more complex than the slab removal had been. Brandon's injuries made it impossible to simply pull him straight up, his broken leg had to be stabilized, his vital signs monitored, and his body temperature raised gradually to avoid cardiac shock. Working in the confined space of the crevice, Dr. Rodriguez administered 4 fluids, pain medication, and wrapped him in heat-retaining blankets. A specialized rescue harness was carefully fitted around his body, designed to distribute the lifting forces evenly and prevent further injury to his fractured leg. Ropes were attached to multiple points on the harness, allowing the surface team to control his ascent with precision. At 7:23 a.m., nearly 10 hours after his fall, Brandon Silverhorn was lifted out of his underground prison and into the pale light of morning. The sight of him shocked even the hardened rescue veterans. His face was gray with hypothermia and pain, his body twisted and broken, his clothing torn and bloodied from his ordeal. But he was alive. Against all odds, through a combination of luck, determination, and the skill of his rescuers, he had survived what should have been certain death. The helicopter flight to University Medical Center in Tucson was a race against time. Brandon's condition was critical. In addition to the compound fracture of his left femur, he was suffering from severe hypothermia, kidney failure from the prolonged pressure on his abdomen, and shock from blood loss and trauma. The surgery to repair Brandon's leg took 8 hours and required the insertion of multiple titanium pins and plates to reconstruct the shattered bone. The kidney damage was severe but not permanent, his organs had been compressed and deprived of proper blood flow for so long that they had begun to shut down, but with dialysis and careful monitoring, they gradually returned to normal function. The hypothermia took weeks to fully resolve. Brandon's core body temperature had dropped so low that his circulatory system had essentially shut down to preserve his vital organs. Gradually, carefully, the medical team warmed his body and restored normal blood flow, but the process was delicate and dangerous. While Brandon fought for his life in the hospital, investigators were trying to piece together exactly what had happened that night at the Safford shafts. The explosion had been far more powerful than anyone could have anticipated, suggesting that the 4 gallons of gasoline had interacted with something else, most likely pockets of methane gas trapped in the underground chambers. Geological surveys revealed that the area was honeycombed with natural gas deposits, the result of organic matter that had been trapped and compressed when the ancient lake dried up millions of years ago. The gasoline vapors had mixed with this methane to create an explosive mixture far more volatile than anything the young men had imagined. The blast had been equivalent to approximately 50 pounds of TNT, enough to shatter bedrock and send debris flying hundreds of yards. It was a miracle that only one person had been seriously injured. The other 4 had been far enough from the blast center to escape with relatively minor injuries, but Brandon's position at the edge of the fissure had put him directly in harm's way. Brandon's recovery was a testament to both medical science and human determination. The physical therapy alone took over a year, learning to walk again on a leg that had been literally rebuilt from titanium and bone grafts. The psychological trauma was equally challenging. For months after the accident, he suffered from claustrophobia so severe that he couldn't ride in elevators or sleep in closed rooms. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of his recovery was coming to terms with the consequences of that night's decision. The knowledge that his reckless decision had put not only himself but his friends and the rescue workers at tremendous risk weighed heavily on his mind. "I replay that night over and over," Brandon said in an interview 2 years after the accident. "If I could take it back, if I could undo what we did, but I can't. All I can do is try to make sure that other people don't make the same mistake we did." The rescue operation at Safford Shafts became a case study in technical rescue operations, studied by emergency response teams across the country. The successful extraction of Brandon from what should have been his tomb required a level of coordination, skill, and courage that exemplified the best of human nature. 25 years have passed since the explosion at Safford Shafts, and Brandon Silverhorn is now a married father of 3, working as a safety inspector for a construction company in Phoenix. His job involves identifying and preventing exactly the kind of dangerous situations that nearly killed him as a young man. "Every day I go to work thinking about risk," he says. "Not just the obvious risks, but the ones people don't see coming. The ones that seem harmless until they're not." The Safford Shafts incident serves as a stark reminder of how quickly things can go wrong when people underestimate the forces they're dealing with. What seemed like a harmless prank, pouring gasoline into a crack in the ground, became a near-fatal disaster because the participants didn't understand the geological and chemical environment they were working in. But the incident also demonstrates the incredible capabilities of modern rescue techniques and the dedication of the men and women who risk their own lives to save others. The successful rescue of Brandon Silverhorn required the coordination of multiple agencies, the deployment of sophisticated equipment, and the skills of dozens of trained professionals working in dangerous conditions. In the final analysis, the explosion at Safford Shafts was entirely preventable. It was the result of young people making a series of poor decisions, each one compounding the risk until disaster became inevitable. Brandon Silverhorn survived his ordeal, but he bears the scars both physical and psychological to this day. His left leg will never be completely normal, cold weather still causes him significant pain from the titanium hardware that holds his bones together. The claustrophobia that developed during his time trapped underground has improved but never completely gone away. The story of what happened at Safford Shafts has become part of the local folklore, a cautionary tale passed down from one generation of desert explorers to the next. And perhaps that's the most important legacy of that terrifying December night, not the disaster itself, but the lessons learned from it. The knowledge that the desert is beautiful but unforgiving, and that respect for its power is the price of survival in one of the world's most challenging environments.